Hello, and welcome to Recognizing and Celebrating Juneteenth, a community conversation with Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. This year, I'm proud to affirm that Brandeis University is observing and will continue to observe Juneteenth as an official university holiday. It joins a growing list of universities, including Antioch, Harvard, and the University System of Maryland, and other organizations such as Allstate, Ford Motor, General Motors, Google, the NFL, Nike, and Workday, to mark this important holiday as it moves in the direction of becoming a national holiday. In this first year of observance for Brandeis, we are fortunate to have a special guest to provide insight, context, and conversation about Juneteenth with Professor Annette Gordon-Reed and Brandeis faculty member, Dr. Abigail Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a faculty member in the History Department in the Department of African and African American Studies, where her work examines the work of ritual and revival and its meaning for political awakening in Black refugee or contraband camps of the American Civil War. These camps were known as contraband camps because African Americans were considered to be between slavery and freedom as confiscated contraband property in US controlled territory across the South. Her work explores kinship formation, post-war political participation, statelessness, and peoplehood in the midst of self-emancipation. I want to express my thanks to both Professor Gordon-Reed as our guest, to Dr. Cooper as our moderator, and to all of you for joining us today in this special conversation on Juneteenth. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Cooper, who will introduce Professor Gordon-Reed.
Thank you so much, President Leibowitz. It is my honor to introduce Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. She is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University and a Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Gordon-Reed has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award in 2008. The Hemingses of Monticello was what she won for, and it is a masterpiece. A selected list of her honors includes a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship, a fellowship from the New York Public Library, the National Humanities Medal, the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Anisfeld Wolf Book Prize. Dr. Gordon-Reed was also elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011 and was a member of the Academy's Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. In 2019, she was elected as a member of the American Philosophical Society. And I want to add personally that I came into graduate school in 2008, right when the Hemingses of Monticello came out. And at Penn, it changed the metric for what could be a dissertation. And I really appreciate that by making the family of Sally Hemings the centerpiece and doing it with such rigorous research, she changed what was possible for history writing. I want to start talking today about her book on Juneteenth. So this book is germane to our right now because of the way that Black Lives Matter and our current political moment has definitely put Juneteenth on the radar. Juneteenth, to give you a very brief definition, June 19th, 1865 was the day when enslaved people celebrated the end of legal slavery in Texas. This book, part history and part memoir, is written as only a daughter of Texas could write it. It connects a national story of enslaved people to her own family's experience, and it makes the story of Juneteenth come to life. So I wanted, Professor Gordon-Reed, please, I wanted you to welcome you and to give you an opportunity to tell us about your book.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you and to hear you say those very nice things about my work. My editor, Bob Weil, has been after me for a number of years to write a book about Texas. We were thinking about a larger book about the history of Texas, and he suggested that I might include my family as part of it, because my family has been in Texas for many generations. And this would be a way into the story. This past year, during the pandemic, after I had done a piece for the New Yorker about the holiday Juneteenth that did talk about the holiday, but also brought my family into it, we got the idea that maybe I could extend it, that I could do a small book that would mix the personal and the historical. And I wouldn't just focus on Juneteenth. I mean, Juneteenth is a part of this, obviously, but I would talk about the road to Juneteenth, why Juneteenth was necessary. Why did there have to be a day when enslaved people were freed? Obviously, you have to talk about slavery and the history of slavery in Texas. And then what happened afterwards? You know, what was life like in Texas after slavery was over? And so I could bring other aspects of my life into the story. I talk about integrating the schools in our town. So it's on Juneteenth is about the day, what happened on that day, but it's also about a broader engagement with the themes surrounding it: slavery, race, racial hierarchy, the civil rights movement, and where we are now. So there's a lot packed in this little book, but I wanted something that would be accessible and something that would tell a story about Texas that a side of Texas that I don't think many people think of. You know, I talk in the book about Texas being seen mainly in terms of the West, and it is a part of the West, it's the Southwest, but the Western part of the state, which really was not the most populous part of the state and not the reason Texas was formed as a republic to have cowboys. I mean, and so forth, that was part of it, but it was a plantation society. And I don't think people think of it in that way.
Yeah. I have to say, as a historian of slavery and emancipation, I so appreciated the way you put that history of Anglo-Texas as a slave state at the center of the story. So I'm hoping you can set the stage for us, the 19th century stage for us a bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the Anglo-Texas origin story that isn't just the Remember the Alamo tale that we might know better.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you grew up in Texas, we take Texas history twice in the 4th and the 7th grade. And so people know about Stephen F. Austin, who is considered the father of Texas. And he was originally from Virginia and by way of Missouri. And his father was given the right to bring settlers into Texas, people who were going to come and become planters. His father passed away and he took up the mantle of Moses Austin and brought families into Texas. And these were people from other southern states in Maine, people who would come there and expect to have slavery as a part of the labor system, people who were hungry for land. That was the big thing, obviously. People wanted to turn Texas into, we're talking the 1820s, turn Texas into a cotton economy to sort of replicate what had happened in Mississippi and other places. Very good land, land for cotton, land for sugar cane, Galveston, a port to ship these things out. It was sort of a good place for this. And these people came over with the expectation that they were going to settle and continue their way of life. Now, Mexico had always had, Texas is a part of Mexico at this point, and they welcomed the Anglo settlers because they were trying to balance them off. We're going to use them as not a buffer, but to stand also against indigenous people who were fighting back, the Comanche and the Apache and there were other indigenous groups even before these folks, but by the time we're here, the Comanches and Apaches are in ascendancy, and so the Anglo settlers were welcome to be soldiers against them to sort of hold territory. But Mexicans were a little ambivalent about slavery and indeed outlaw slavery. They kind of looked the other way for the Texas province because of the political nature of what I just said, why these settlers were welcome. But there was always this insecurity about what might happen if they decided to get serious about it. So at some point, the Texians, as they were called, decide that they're going to have their own republic. And they fight against Mexico and they established the Texas Republic in 1836. And unlike the American Constitution, which kind of pussyfoots around about slavery, persons held to service, that kind of thing, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas is very explicit that this is a slave society, that this is going to be a slaveholders' republic. And that it's a white man's government as well, because people of color, African people, they can't become, people of African descent can't become citizens. So this is, this is why there was a big, as I'm sure you know, this is one of the reasons that Texas was a controversial subject in the Union, with people not wanting it to enter because it would come in as a slave state. And also the Republic suffered to some degree because people overseas were not happy with this idea of the sort of naked statements about this. I mean, it's one thing to talk about slavery as a necessary evil and kind of hem and haw about it, to sort of show that you think that it's a problem, but this is a full-throated support of the institution. So it comes in as a republic. It lasts for only 10 years. They're beset by economic problems. They ran out of money. They wanted to become a part of the United States. It would also help them in their concerns about Mexico if they were under the umbrella of the United States. And Texas comes into the Union in 1845 as a slave state. And, from there has relatively brief time, I guess, in the Union before they join the Confederacy. And so this is a place that has a very, very hard history for African Americans. There was not a time where there was this slavery is a necessary evil. It was always this notion that this is what we're going to do, and that's cause for the ambivalence that I talk about in the book. I mean, how do you celebrate? How do African American people celebrate the Texas Republic, republic that we wouldn't have been able to live in, a republic that was established for slavery, with slavery, and it did other things as well, but for the protection of slavery.
Yeah, I felt very much that whatever federalism concerns might have been it's so obviously subterfuge for instead what it really designs itself as is this is going to be a modern slave-holding republic where slavery will go on in perpetuity. And you can see very much, even during the Civil War, you can see those people who are trying to continue slavery are always moving into Texas so that they can do that. Mm-hmm. And I found it striking. I thought what was one of the things that was really striking was the way you bring out Steve Austin's pitch for why Anglo people needed to be able to bring in enslaved, unpaid laborers, because if they didn't, they would be poor for generations. Mm-hmm. That there was no way to make Texas profitable, to make the land profitable without that labor, which immediately gives gives so much valence to the idea that who made the land flourish, who made it prosperous. It was Black labor. But I think what's interesting though is that it didn't have to, and you make this, I wanted to bring out a quote from your book. It didn't have to be that way. And this is where I see that you very much struggling with your own affinity, your own identification with Texas, and your own grappling with that history. Still, nothing is inevitable. Things could have been different. The choice for slavery was deliberate, and that reality is hard to square with the desire to present a pristine and heroic origin story about the settlement of Texas. There is no way to do that without suggesting that the lives of African Americans and their descendants in Texas did not and do not matter. What I saw here was such a clear call to say we have to put slavery at the center of our story and reckon with that, even as you were talking about your own identification and love for Texas. And I thought that was such an important note to make. I wondered, as we're talking about Juneteenth, as Juneteenth will indeed put Texas back into the spotlight right now as we discuss it, do you think that that Juneteenth itself should be an opportunity for us to probe the long freedom struggle that starts with that legacy of slavery and how its centrality needs to be part of our stories?
Yes, I think it's a good step. It's a good first step into that process. When I was growing up, it was mainly a holiday that was for African Americans. I mean, I don't know, and I would have been a kid, so I can't speak with total authority, but my impression from what I was able to observe was that it was mainly Black people who were celebrating it. It became a state holiday in 1980, and even before then, the sort of local news stations would cover the parades and so forth. So you got a sense that it was broadening out in Texas, and then it becomes a state holiday, and I suppose now all people there celebrate it. But it's a way to talk about these kinds of things. It's very, very tough because, you know, we grow up with these iconic figures, these names, Lamar, and you know, who was not a great guy, Mirabeau Lamar, you know, when it came to indigenous people and slavery and so forth. I mean, and Stephen F. Austin, all of these people that we're taught to revere are involved in some really pretty rough stuff. And you have to, as historians, we are used to this kind of thing, right? I mean, we look at the past and we know the kinds of things that people do, and we are accustomed to having, if not an ironic, it's some degree of detached look at them, but that may not be the case with everyday citizens, people who aren't in this all the time. And it's hard to think of, or to tell people to think about people whom they admired as involved in something that was flawed, doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, who were involved in a tragedy in a way. And you can't ignore that. I mean, because it makes certain people feel uncomfortable. You can't take the history of my family and the family of millions of other Texans over the years and say, well, we have to hide that because this makes us uncomfortable. That's just another way of saying, you know, the world is really about whites in Texas, and your concerns don't really count. No, they do count, and we can live together and we can be citizens together, but we have to tell the truth about the things that happened. And that's hard to do. I mean, I'm sure you know they're grappling with that as we speak down there now with various laws that were designed to try to shore up the image that can't withstand scrutiny if you actually look at the documents. You know, it's not a matter of my interpretation saying that Texas was formed as a slaveholders republic. It's in the Constitution. You know?
Yeah, it's. I mean, the citations that you bring out, the pieces where they're cribbing directly from the Constitution and the Declaration, and they're crossing out anything that could be potentially turned into equality for Black people, is really stunning. Yeah. Which is also what makes the June 19th reversal so stunning too, because it's not just legal slavery's ended. It's also the possibility. It's the kind of announcement of start performing your equality with the people who now who had just yesterday been considered your enslavers. No, that's the amazing thing about
Granger's order. It's not just saying slavery's over. You're now going to exist in a state of absolute equality with people who were enslavers, and you can imagine how that felt for the people who heard those words and who thought that this was going to be the new reality. And on the other, both the Black people and the white people. And as you know, many of the white people were not pleased by this. And some of the celebrations were met with violence on the part of whites who resented the loss of these people as chattel, but probably also were ticked off by the language of equality. Because, as you alluded to before, Texas has a Declaration of Independence that basically takes, Jefferson's structure, but leaves out the part about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, because that wasn't their idea, and they understood what an incendiary, whether Jefferson and these people believed it or not, that was an incendiary statement because people took that to heart and made something of it. Well, they weren't going to have any chances of anybody doing that with the Texas Declaration. And then the Constitution that we've talked about that explicitly talks about, provides for slavery, and you can't free slaves, and Black people can't live here. So, this notion of equality, this notion of the future, because I'm sure these people, the enslaved, former enslaved, knew that this wasn't, you were going to snap your finger and then it would all be over, that it would be a process. But the purpose of commemorating this moment for me is to commemorate what I know must have been the tremendous hope that they had at this point. Not that we're saying everything was done and it was all great, because it wasn't, but the hope for a better future that was in the minds of these people who had suffered so much.
I absolutely saw how, even as our job as historians is to oftentimes explode mythologies, to really hold to the fire all of those different symbols. But I think what was really important about this book and about your engagement with this, the history of this holiday, was how important symbols are.
Mm-hmm.
And even as a lot of white Texans, white Americans, as those who have received different heroic tales have to disassemble those received narratives, there's also I feel very much your own understanding of, I still want to revere and take seriously that Black people weren't romanticizing. They weren't just kind of doe-eyed, fools doing a hopeful fool's errand. They were marking Juneteenth on the landscape, because the more they marked it, the more it meant something. I mean, and you think about Texas, in 1865, it's hasn't been a state for that long. No. And there are now a lot of Black people there. And it's one of those things, Heather Williams in her book, Help Me Find My People, talks about more people had reunions in Texas than they did in Virginia and in the former enslaved states of the original 13 colonies. And that is very much about that diaspora, of that cotton diaspora. Mm-hmm. But it does show you how, despite all of the efforts of those engineers, you still have Black Texas very much impossible to deny. Yeah. I really hope that you can also talk something about this other point, which is the 1960s as a kind of mirror image of the 1860s landscape, because this is where you talk about being one of the first people to desegregate the schools in mm-hmm. Conroe, Texas. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was, it was quiet. It wasn't Ruby Bridges with lots of cameras, but it was still quite a lot, considering how young you were in elementary school, mm-hmm. But also showing that even in the 1960s, about a decade after Brown v. Board, desegregation wasn't happening until people actually were going to the schools, were starting to that you were in those classrooms. So I wanted to ask a little bit about that experience. Mm-hmm. And also, your mother also figures very prominently here as an educator. So take us through that experience of you mm-hmm. desegregating the schools in Texas.
Well, as you were saying, this is after Brown. This is about a decade after Brown, and Texas and other states were resisting. They were coming up with ways around, trying to find ways around the order to desegregate. Separate is inherently unequal, and so forth. And they came up with what was called a freedom of choice plan. And with the idea that people would choose, they would know what to choose. Parents would pick white schools for their kids, and Black parents would pick the Black schools. My mother was a teacher in what was the Black school, Booker T. Washington. It was a school that went from K through 12. And she taught English. And she and my father decided to leave my two older brothers in Washington School, Booker T as they called it. And I would go to Anderson Elementary School, which was a white school. And as I talk in the book about their sort of shifting explanations for why they did this, by the time as they became more disillusioned by what happened with integration, their particularly my father, their answer as to why they did this became much more pragmatic. They were saying, well, we just did it because we knew that the courts were going to strike down these plans and you would already be in place and blah, blah, blah. But I think they were more idealistic. I think they were doing it because it was part of, this is the mid 60s, and there's the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. People were marching. There'd been the March on Washington. There was a spirit in the air, and I think that they were moved by that. But as they began to see that it wasn't the panacea, maybe the answer that they may have thought it was going to be, or it didn't have as many great effects as they thought. As I said, they became, it was less of a big deal. It was more about pragmatism than idealism, but I suspect they were idealistic. So it was a big deal. You know, I was 6. I knew it was something that was important. I talk about one of my relatives who lived in Houston and was very, very excited about this and went off to this really fancy department store, Sakowitz, and bought all these clothes for me. You know, I had clothes obviously, but she was like, no, you know, we're gonna do this right. And this is like her contribution to civil rights, to have, you know, to participate in this. So I knew it was a big deal, but they had agreed ahead of time with the school district and the newspapers that no one would make a big deal about it. I would just go, and it would be just sort of an ordinary thing. And my father drove me. I didn't take the bus because that might have been a risky kind of thing. So my father drove me and dropped me off, and I started there, and that was it. Sometimes, you know, there would be people who would come and stand in the doorway and watch like they were looking at some experiment that was going on here. And I understood what that was about. But my teacher, Mrs. Daughtry, I think everybody remembers their first grade teacher, their kindergarten, their first grade teacher, was just wonderful. She was very supportive and didn't treat me any differently than other kids. As I say, in the book, I was a good student, so I think I made it easy for them. Mm-hmm. I'm not a troublesome personality. I mean, a pretty even-tempered person, and I was a good student, so I didn't cause problems. And so from that standpoint, it was quite good. There were some kids who were nice, and there were some kids who were not nice. I particularly remember a family of girls who were very poor. I could tell they were poor because their mother had made clothes. She'd gotten some material, a large amount of material, and it was the same dress, you know, different material and so forth. And I knew that they didn't have very much, but they made it a point always to come over and ask me to play, you know, Red Rover or whatever it was they were doing. And so I knew that not all white people were exactly the same. I don't know whether their parents told them to do that or whether they did it or whether they felt like outcasts themselves because they were obviously not. I mean, this was a very prosperous town. It started as an oil town and had a sawmill, and it was at some point in the 30s had more millionaires than any place. I mean, it was that kind of place. So, but they stood out, I think, as poor. And I wonder if that was something that influenced how they treated me. So it was tough. My mother said I broke out in hives at some point. I don't remember that. But it's like everything, you know, you look back on stuff, and I focus on the fun things that happen, not my predominant feeling about this is not one of having been stressed. I think of the funny things that happen, and that happens to all human beings. That's what we do. And I was there by myself until the next year, another family decided to send their daughter. And then this went on for 3 years, and then the court struck down freedom of choice plans, and then everybody had to change schools. And I was already in place there. And I talk in the book about how it was not, a lot of Black people in the community really weren't happy about that because Booker T was a beloved school, and they lost that community. They lost, in some instances, teachers as role models. And some of the kids blame me for that. I mean, so I had this feeling, I had this, you know, from the time I was 6, I was always somebody who was in some ways on display. And there were people who liked what I had done, and there were people who didn't like what I had done. And there were people I didn't know who could be very, very hostile toward me or threatening towards me. And I just didn't know who they were because they knew who I was. And so it was this weird thing of being a person who was known for that and having different responses to it, positive and negative.
I thought your piece on the way that you were a symbol of loss. You talk about a boy who was in the bus line with you, and he was a student of Booker T, and the switch was happening, and he punches you, and you're very sympathetic to the idea of like, I was a symbol of a loss. I also, you talk about your mom, who your mother was one of the few Black teachers who didn't lose her position, but she moved to the formerly white school. Can you talk a little bit about, her as an educator? Because I think that's not something that's well known in our history, the kind of aftershocks of.
This is something that happened all across the South. People have written about this, the fact that a number of Black teachers, integration brought the kids together, but it didn't really bring the professionals together. There was not an equal exchange of teaching duties among Blacks and whites. And she felt that, she'd said, she'd gone to school. My mother went to Spelman, and then she went to Texas Southern University for graduate school, but then she had us, and then she, was a teacher, just a high school teacher, not just. They worked very, very hard. And she said, I went to school to teach Black students. She was part of that generation that saw itself in a vanguard. They were kind of on the move, after in the 50s and the 60s. And people were supposed to be doing things to move the race forward. Is this good for Black people? And that's what she wanted to do. Well, once integration came in and she became a teacher, most of her students were white. She loved all of her students, and she was a great teacher. But that sense of mission that she had, that had sent her to become a teacher, had to change. The mission had to change. It wasn't, she said, we can't talk to them the way they used to talk to them at Booker T, where you would sort of mix understandings about education with this idea that they were part of a group of people who had, that word again, mission, that they were doing something that was for themselves, but also for a group of people, for the people of Juneteenth. I mean, that this was a connected to ancestors and the journey of African-American people from Africa to slavery and out of slavery and into resistance. That's what this was about. Well, she couldn't do that, couldn't talk the same way in a classroom where there were maybe 3 or 4 Black kids and 25 white kids, because it had no application to white kids. So, I mean, she found a mission in teaching them and loving them as her students, but it was different for her. So, there was a sense of loss there, even for her. And integration, of course, changed many things. I go back to my hometown now, which is almost unrecognizable because it's gotten so large. But even before then, in those years before it really began to boom, and I would go back, I would see, socially it felt more comfortable. You didn't worry about going into stores or things like that, the kind of feeling you had as Black people during this time period. But the economic situation hasn't changed very much. I mean, the lives of Black people, other than now you don't have to sit in the balcony, which is what we had to do when we went to the theater, or we didn't have separate waiting rooms we don't have separate waiting rooms at the clinic anymore. But it didn't affect change in the way that I think a lot of people thought it might.
Yeah,
So.
the way education is often positioned as that kind of like, this is the gateway to justice, when the whole community needs to be there. I think one of the things that really struck me was how much you talked about the community experience, and education was an act of resistance that people understood kind of intuitively.
Yeah. And the kids understood that. The kids would, we'd be playing and the kids would sort of run in the house, and I would figure out what's going on here. And one of the teachers would be walking by or driving by, and they didn't want the teacher to see them outside playing. Well, I don't know that I would have, if Mrs. Daughtry or Mrs. Gilliland, my second grade teacher, happened through my neighborhood, I don't think I would have that same kind of response, because we just didn't have that kind of connection. We were Texans, we were teacher student, we had all those connections made sense, but there wasn't that. I mean, for the people who went to Booker T. Washington, education was not just in the classroom. It was, your teachers were your teachers 24 hours a day. I mean, they were all around you. They went to your church, they were in your communities and so forth. So it was a different kind of feeling, and that was lost. I don't want to romanticize legalized Jim Crow. I mean, that's not what I'm saying, but it's like anything, there are gains and there are losses.
Yeah. I think you, and that's one of the things that you feel as a kind of a theme throughout this book too, is the complicated histories, and another one of those is, you talk about indigenous histories in Texas. This Texas itself has this hybridity, this multiculturalism, this its history. I think one of the things you do as you're talking about origin stories, and I think this is also kind of apropos because as a professor at Harvard, which is of course home to its own origin story of a kind of religious dissenters, the Puritans, coming very well read, founding Harvard for its clergy, and that has its own vision of a city upon a hill exceptionalism, but Texas doesn't usually figure into the equation as a particular origin story of America, and yet it's still very much a bellwether. It's big, it's the giant state, and it's also this place where you talk about your father's own engagement with with visions of indigenous histories, and your own probing of what complicated histories those were. Could you talk a little bit about this, kind of your own probing of the indigenous history and the way it dovetailed with African American history?
Well, I mean, it came through a lot of ways through my father, who romanticized. We talk about mythology, and it isn't just white Texans who have mythologies. Black people, all groups of people have mythologies. And in his idea, there was sort of a mythical connection between indigenous people and African Americans because of their respective conflicts with Europeans. And that somehow in his mind, they should have been allies and therefore they were. Well, sometimes they were, but sometimes they were not. I mean, sometimes indigenous people were slaveholders. They enslaved Africans, particularly ones who saw themselves as, the civilized tribes, or whatever you want to call it, people who were establishing themselves as Europeans with the hope perhaps that they would be left alone, that if they became like, that they would do. And so slave ownership was a part of Native American culture, of some Native American culture among some people. And I don't know if my father knew this. He probably, if he knew it, it was not anything that he ever talked about. But the notion of Texas as a site of struggle for enslaved people and for indigenous people was very much alive in him. And he did have that sort of mythical, this sort of a connection that he thought was natural. And we know that it wasn't natural. It happened sometimes and sometimes it did not. But I happened to be born about 17 miles from the Alabama Coushatta Indian Reservation. And when I talk in the chapter about how most of the popular Hollywood, the popular presentations of Texas, Native Americans were, indigenous people were people of the past. They were here and they're not here anymore. Well, I knew that they were there because they were there in Livingston, right outside of where I was born. And we used to visit the Indian reservation. And this was in the 70s when Native American iconography and so forth was so popular. You know, they were other romanticizing Native Americans in popular culture. And it was sort of an interesting thing to be, you know, sort of another part of the Texas story, another part of the story to have Native Americans brought into the mix in a way that they're typically not, because they people are written off as if they had disappeared, and they were there. They were always there, and trying to figure out how we fit in all of this. And I had to think a lot about that. I had occasion to think a lot about that, you know, much more so than if I had not lived next, you know, right so close to this and actually had experiences with native peoples who lived in that area.
It's been really interesting to see as we've been having conversations about Indigenous peoples and African Americans, and my students are always surprised to find out these complicated histories, and yet there's also that there's such an obvious exchange of knowledge. But there's also this idea of sovereignty and rights, and how you engage with America, with what was Anglo-America, and
exactly.
how Anglo-America oftentimes tried to create rifts between those who
oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it's, we're talking about reckonings with race now. There that is coming to pass between Native peoples and African American people today too, trying to find some rapprochement, find some way to talk about these very, very complicated things. I think I say complicated a couple of times in the book because it just really is. And you know this, I mean, the story is very seldom simple. You go in thinking, okay, this is how this works, or having an idea about how something works. And the more you look, you realize, no, that's not really how it works. It's kind of like that, but not exactly like that. And anybody who's looking for a totally comforting story from these things is going to be disappointed, because human beings are complicated. And as you're saying here, this is such a volatile and such an explosive mixture here. I say that Texas has all of the currents of American history run through it. I mean, the conflict between Europeans and indigenous people, plantation slavery, the Jim Crow after the end of all of this, westward expansion. They are the question of Latino versus Anglo culture, all of it in this one place. And they're next to, and they have a foreign country on the border there. And it's no wonder it's so volatile. But the idea, the image of the cowboy and the oil man, typically white, typically male. I say Texas is constructed as a white man. What does that mean for me and women, white women, all other kinds of people who are not white men? And that's why Texas seems a mystery to people, because you have this idea of what it is, and then all these problems come out of there that don't seem to, what does that have to do with, anything? What does that have to do with cowboys? What is this racial things? What's going on? And even though cowboys, many of them were Black, we don't know that either. That's not said very much. But it confounds people because this part of it is missing. A part of it is always, left out of the story.
And you can tell these different facts that some people might have said. I've studied Civil War history my whole life, but no one understood that. Okay, the Black soldiers, well, they had 3-year contracts, and why do they all end up in Texas? Because their contracts weren't up, and they get stationed in Texas oftentimes to suppress Native attacks.
Yeah.
And it's which in and of itself becomes a kind of a way that different Anglo-American structures were trying to create. Now your membership with us now necessitates this.
Oh, it's a very complicated story. I mean, the Union soldiers look great when we're talking about the soldiers of the United States Army. We're saying these things now, not Union soldiers anymore. But the Army of the United States looks great during this time period. But when it's over and we turn to West, it's not so great. You know, it's a problematic story for African Americans and for white soldiers too. So it's this idea of having a patriotic history that's a story of nothing but cloudless glory and great things is just, it just doesn't work. If and you have to face the fact, it's like life. It's very, very tough.
And so I can already hear people, you know, as this is going to be, I know that we're launching a book talks, seminars around this book. And I think already that people are going to want to, okay, here's how they're going to retell the story in that one soundbite, which is not really doable, but it does at least put on the radar, like, it's not the 10-gallon white guy, you know, 10-gallon hat and white guy and oil man, cowboy, rancher, hybrid, but whatever it is, it looks like something we can just imagine Ted Cruz playing that role. It's instead Annette Gordon Reed is Texas. It's very much of understanding how much you really put out there your identity with Texas. And I think one of the things I want to draw attention to in that coda is that you take up Thomas Jefferson writes in the Notice on the State of Virginia that, you know, an enslaved person and, you know, presumably his descendants could not possibly feel love for a country that once enslaved him. And yet you're writing about love in the coda, which is not, historians don't traditionally write about love. Lots of love outside of their lexicon. And yet you ask that question, the reader might ask, like, how can I love this place? And even your asking of it changes the frame so that you have been doing a kind of rigorous, like, here's where you have to see contingency, we have to see complication, we have to really go back and read. And yet you still say that doesn't necessarily mean discarding love or all the things that bring us to those origin stories. And so I really wanted to, because right now I can think about places I identify with, places I feel estranged from, because the news images or the different ways that we now have to grapple with our current now. I wondered, when we talk about love, when we talk about amor patriae, we often talk about patriotism itself as a dangerous ism. And a place is not just the place, the geography, but it's about the people, and especially as we kind of see sometimes the news or just our own neighbors and fearing a little bit of what's trying to be suppressed. People are hard to love. So I wanted to ask a little bit about love and critique. You talk about love necessitating critique. So I wondered, like, now you've written this book, you're talking about this book, where do you stand on your own feeling of loving a place and critiquing it? Can you talk us through some of that as we try to go through hard conversations that I believe we're only at the beginning of?
Well, it's a tough thing. It's not an easy thing, but I think love means critique. It involves that. And when I say this in the coda, because if you really care about a person, if you care about yourself, if you care about a place, you want it to improve. If you think that you can add something or suggest something or find a way to help that person or that place find its true self, its highest self, and if you want people do that for me. People have critiqued me, my mother and my father, and people who cared a lot about me. My mother didn't just say, oh, everything about you is wonderful and everything you do is fine and you're never wrong. If I did things that were not good, not operating, you could do better than that, be a better person than that, it was incumbent upon, she thought it was incumbent upon her to tell me this. And I don't mean, and as I say in the book, how you do it matters. I mean, she wasn't it's not about being mean to people or vicious or anything like that, but it's caring enough about a person to help them to become better. And I think that is real love. It's not just whatever you do is fine. I mean, that's you don't really care. I find it hard to think that that's truly caring about a place if you don't try to correct or to offer suggestions. And loving a place, as you said, to me, and I say it in the book, that loving a place is, yeah, I like the geography to some extent, but I love geography of New England as well. And California is beautiful. Upstate New York is wonderful too. But it's the people there, it's the experiences, it's the things. And I use the Jefferson quote when he says, you know, after writing that, you know, notes in the state of Virginia and his the sort of liberal position that there should be emancipation, but expatriation. When he's really down to talking about people he knows, he says, no, they should be able to stay in Virginia because this is where their family and their connections are. That's what it is, your family and your connections. And connections includes people, but all the things that you've done there, the experiences you've had there, the people you've buried there, the people you've met there, all of that goes into it. And sure, there are bad people around who try to make it difficult for you, but they shouldn't have the right to claim the place by their hostility to you, or if they don't recognize your humanity, that's on them. But I know people there who did recognize my humanity. I know people there who I loved and who loved me, and I had wonderful experiences there. And I think the state, I'm very excited about the young people and people who are who see themselves trying to change the state and to move forward, to make it not just a white man, but it's what it's always been, a state full of diverse people who care about the place and want to make it better, and who don't think that it's all about a hierarchy. And so I'm optimistic. I mean, there are a lot of interesting news coming out of Texas these days, but there's good news that's about it as well. And I've gotten such wonderful letters from people and comments from people about the book and about their experiences and their hopes for the state as well, that I'm optimistic about it.
Thank you so much. I'm forced to now turn to our community questions, but I am so appreciative for you answering mine and you engaging me. So I sent them here and I'm gonna just bring them up. Okay, so let's since we were just ending there, let me pull up this particular one. To interpret the purpleness of Texas. So someone wants to say, how do you interpret the purpleness of Texas? There are a lot of news coming. There's a lot of news coming out right now, and Texas itself, when you talk about it being a bellwether, certainly for education, and so much of this book is about education and what our education, how it needs to tilt. So could you tell us a little bit about, what your take is on the future of Texas? We know, I want to say caveat, historians are not prophesiers.
Yeah.
We do the fast.
You can't predict. Yeah, exactly.
We can't predict. We're not economists throwing out like, here's the projection for the next 4 years. But
we don't do modeling.
Exactly.
I think that there are a lot of people who want to turn the state purple and blue, or blue even. It's often said, I've seen people say that Texas is not a red state, it is a voter suppressed state. So a lot depends on what happens with voting. And if some of the measures that are designed, the anti-democratic anti-democratic capital D and small d, some of those things take place, it's going to be harder to do. But if we can stave off voter suppression, we may eventually be able to pull off what they pulled off in Georgia. And we didn't make it this time, but I think that there's a hunger for that, and there's an appetite for it, and there's a shot. I think with the number of people who are moving there and the experience that they had in the last election, where we didn't triumph, but they've seen Democrats, and I should say I'm a Democrat. It's not like I'm I can hide that. They saw that it mattered in other states, and votes do matter. For the longest time, everybody said, voting doesn't matter, but we know now that it does. And I think it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And so I think that there's a shot that there might be changes.
Thank you. I'm excited. Let's wait and see. I have I only have time for one last question, but if you wouldn't mind, I think this is apropos because, we are Brandeis, we are a higher education institution, and we are right now making Juneteenth this honored, commemorated day. So what should institutions be doing to be truly accountable to the spirit of Juneteenth? What's the difference between a kind of performative, just a mere performance, and a real lived change and accountability?
Mm-hmm. Well, do the things that many universities are trying to do: increase diversity of the faculty, the curriculum, and engaging students in these questions. These kinds of events, providing opportunity for people to talk about these issues. I mean, it's not until you leave school that you realize all the things that are available to people in a university setting. I just think fostering conversations among people, and open conversations, and conversations where people can feel free to say what they really feel, and even if it's unpopular, because I think that that's a first step towards understanding among people. So I think all of the values, the sort of liberal, and I mean that the L values, small L values of education, liberal arts education, should be brought to bear here. And that involves conversation, opportunities for people, for classes, for people to discuss these questions, and speakers and fora like this.
Thank you so much for that. I am going to turn my microphone over to President Leibowitz, and thank you just so sincerely for the conversation.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. I had a good time.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to add my thanks first to Professor Cooper for moderating this and really carrying out this conversation that was enlightening. I think memoir, the personal history that Professor Gordon-Reed provided for us to understand the larger context of Juneteenth was really valuable, and something that we would not have gotten. We all look forward to reading the book on Juneteenth. And of course, as you said, to pursuing all things that we can on campus to not make this performative, but rather real change on our university campus at Brandeis and elsewhere. Thanks so much. I highly recommend this book. It's terrific. And once again, thank you all for joining us in celebrating Juneteenth. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.